Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Committee. Thank you very much for having us here today. I think probably just important to maybe give you a flavour of, I suppose, what the national overview of the Muirburn footprint looks like. And kind of the best source of this, I would argue, comes actually from the Scottish Government Stage 2 research into the socio-economic and biodiversity impacts of driven grouse moors, and in particular the paper by Keith Matthews and others in 2020. They mapped grouse butts onto rough grazing in Scotland, which covered 491 landholdings in all, and that spanned a total of 1 million hectares. And of those 1 million hectares, about 858,000 hectares were classified as rough grazing, of which 163,000 hectares, that's 19%, was subjected to Muirburn. And then if you look a little bit more granular, if you go within 2 kilometres of the grouse butts, the total area of rough grazing falling within those 2 kilometres was 584,000 hectares, and of that, some 146,000 hectares, that's 25%, was subject to Muirburn. So if you're looking at kind of the extent of it across Scotland, it probably applies, certainly in relation to driven grouse moor management, to about 163,000 hectares. But in terms of the rotations that you mentioned, Convener, you're talking usually between 10 and 25 years, although between 10 and 15 years is probably more commonplace for grouse moor management. And the size of the Muirburn strips can vary, and obviously we don't have a practitioner who actually does Muirburn maybe on the ground here today that can give us this insight, but we've consulted widely, and generally fires are kept to between about 10 to 15 metres wide, and they generally get smaller over the years because the fuel load is being managed over that time. And what I would argue here as well is that there are much crossover with agricultural interests, because clearly these land uses are integrated. You've got sheep farming operations quite often coexisting with grouse moor management operations, and as a result, some of the Muirburn for moorland game and wildlife tends to benefit livestock and vice versa.
So, just to be clear, I'm a Muirburn practitioner, however, I have got experience with fires, and it's just a point of clarity that the fires that happened last week have got nothing to do with the Muirburn. Muirburn season is completely finished, and we're now into a completely different season, so fires that are started from mid-April onwards, really to conflate them with Muirburn.
Thanks, Convener. Just to say, the vast majority of grouse moor managers specifically do already adhere to the Muirburn Code, and indeed there's been a really concerted effort just in the last year to undertake the voluntary training, the LANTRA approved training that's been developed by Bright Spark, Burning Techniques, Nature Scot and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. So just to put that on the record. And also I was struck last week by Professor Newton's sentiments, who said, and I quote, "The management of fires in general, at least on grouse moors, I think has improved enormously, at least in my lifetime." And I'd certainly endorse that and caveat, well, supported, I suppose, by saying also the development of kind of new equipment, from fogging units through to leaf blowers. Equipment like this that basically enables, Muirburn to be conducted really professionally. And just a final point, Convener, just to say that, just back to your kind of key question, Rhoda, your analysis of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee call for views noted that there was 46.5%, that's a majority of people, against the proposed licensing system for Muirburn, and 2 of the most commonly cited words were unreasonable and disproportionate. So just to kind of give you a flavour maybe of the wider views associated beyond this room. Convener, and I appreciate your point about the Climate Change Committee's report, because their actual words in their 2023 report to the Parliament was that the Climate Change Committee is in the process of reviewing its previous recommendations on the practice of rotation. Thank you, Convener. Duncan's assessment there, or characterisation of the Nature Scot report, he actually missed out quite an important detail, which is where they said that there was a, quote, plausible mechanism through which the intensity of wildfire could be influenced as a result of controlled burning. And indeed, I'd refer the committee as well to Professor Newton's remarks from last week, where he said all the big ones, we're talking about wildfire, have been on areas that have not been burned for several decades. So there's a huge build-up of dry trash on the ground to get the fire going. And I completely support re-wetting as an endeavour, as a tool in the box for managing wildfire mitigation. But I think we all need to be clear that it's not on its own going to cut it. And actually the fact that we've seen wildfire kind of engulfing places such as Forsonard and Dovestone that RSPB manage, just shows that re-wetting perhaps on its own just isn't quite cutting it.
Nick.
Thank you, Convener. We absolutely acknowledge that the science around Muirburn is complex, to say the least. But where we do see a distinction in some of the differences in results from science is where you look at the length of time in which studies have been conducted, and typically where you see negative impacts on ecosystem services through Muirburn on peatlands, they tend to have been conducted over a 3-year period, maybe a 5-year period at best, because that reflects the funding models for most of our academic institutes in the UK. If you start to look at longer-term studies, looking at burning over an actual real-term period of a burning cycle, you start to see that over time you actually get ecosystem service benefits. And at the moment, if we look at the bill as it is being introduced, there is, and the separation of burning on peatlands and land that's not peatland, there is no provision in the bill to allow burning on peatland to deliver these ecosystem service benefits, and that, I think, will tie the Scottish Government's hands in terms of what they can do to deliver on biodiversity and climate change.
Thanks, Convener, and completely support Dr Hesford's analysis there of the science and certainly the limitations around shorter-term studies. And those studies that use before-after control impact methodologies tend to be the ones that produce the most robust evidence. I think I was just a little bit taken aback by what I just heard from Nature Scots. I mean, I think I just need to set out very briefly, if I may, Convener, what do we stand to lose if we don't properly conduct Muirburn and thereby manage the wildfire risk? And, I think just looking at a very brief example, Saddleworth Moor fire in 2018, 7 centimetres of peat were lost in that fire. It will apparently take 200 years to restore that peat, and it released somewhere in the region of between 17,798 and 26,281 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent from the soil carbon losses, and that does not take into account the emissions from the vegetation that burned as a result as well. So I think we just need to remind ourselves, about the role that burning can play when it comes to reducing fuel load, because as far as I'm concerned, it's fundamentally important. Thanks, Convener. And just following on from Robbie's comments, I completely accept the points. We are in a climate and biodiversity emergency, but we're also in a just transition, and I think the onus is on us to ensure that land managers actually have the tools at their disposal to be able to go out and do what government is asking of them properly. So I think the 50 centimetre depth base would not be unreasonable, given we have that data available. And secondly, there's been a lot of talk about the use of peat probes, which I understand are very simple to use, but the Nature Scot review of off Muirburn last year noted that there is, however, a constraint with this method in terms of the time required to carry out survey, which will depend on the scale involved and the level of and detail required. Now, clearly, in the context of our larger land holdings, that presents a significant challenge. So we would massively welcome much more greater information, I suppose, at this stage about what sort of kind of methodology will be used for determining the peat depth, because that is a clear kind of vacant area within the bill at the moment. But would certainly kind of echo the sentiments about the climate and nature emergencies and the importance, I suppose, of managing fuel load on peatland to protect it for years to come. Thanks, Convener. I think, Karen, in response to your question, that I'd refer again to last week's remarks from Professor Newton, which I thought were quite instructive in this point, where he kind of talked about one licensing scheme covering the lot. And I think that's really important because from our perspective, we do not think that the mechanisms for determining peat depth will provide sufficient certainty to land managers, and ultimately the provisions of the bill currently would technically, make it an offence to make an erroneous submission. And if you've not followed the methodology to the letter, then there is a real risk, I suppose, of you being prosecuted or caught out by the legislation. So the fact that we don't have a methodology to actually scrutinise here is a big part of the problem. And so I think on that basis we would advocate for a licensing scheme which kind of removes the peatland licensing scheme in toto. So you've got one licensing scheme with the broadest range of licensable purposes, but you've still got Nature Scot kind of applying its discretion perhaps in those areas where the peat is that little bit deeper, if that's its concern. And I think one of the principal motivations of this convener I must set out, which is really important, is that paragraph 202 of the Policy Memorandum acknowledges that national survey data for peat measured at 40 centimetres does not exist. And that massively exacerbates the uncertainty for land managers. And I think it's really important and quite instructive, actually, that during the development of the heather and grass regulations in 2021, one of the foremost things that the Secretary of State did before he actually pushed the green button on those regulations was ensuring that on designated sites that there was peat mapping data there at 40 centimetres. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. But if we're going to be absolutely pushing this narrative that we need to have a peatland licensing scheme based on some measure of peat depth, because the data exists at the 50 centimetres threshold, our strongest view is that really it should be at 50 centimetres. And Professor Werity said last week, the existing map is based on 50 centimetres, and if you migrate away from that, then clearly you have a challenge in how you determine that. And he also went on to say that developing that new national data set at 40 centimetres would be a major undertaking to effectively remap Scotland's peat soils. And the final thing, Convener, just before I finish, is that I draw your attention as also all committee members to the 40th report of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, which states in relation to the ability for Scottish ministers to amend the definition of peat and peatland via the affirmative procedure that, and I quote, it considers that any change to this provision may merit greater parliamentary scrutiny than just the wholly endorse what Bruce has just said. Just a point of concern that's been raised by some of our members who are undertaking peatland restoration, which is something we fully obviously support and something we need to be doing. There is concern among some members about the risk posed by an increased fuel load build-up as a result of the provisions in this bill. bill about their investment that they've obviously put into peatland restoration, and indeed the vast amounts of public money that have gone into it as well. So just a note to say that, you know, the implications of this bill will carry implications also for things like peatland restoration, which clearly a lot of people have invested money in. A lot of the public purse has been used on that. I think it's important that we, you know, make sure that this bill adequately provides resilience for our landscapes to protect. Thanks, Convener. Just to say that Scottish Land and Estates support our members in terms of developing integrated wildfire management plans and also placing their resources, if they feel they're able to, on the Community Asset Register, which allows them to be used by the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service in the incident of a wildfire taking hold. I just want to draw the committee's attention to two key problems as we see it surrounding wildfire with the bill. So the first is the presumption that exists against Muirburn on peatland, which basically says that Scottish ministers may grant a licence where the licence relates to peatland if they are satisfied that no other method of vegetation control is available. Now, we think that carries catastrophic consequences, not least because what it does is it ultimately prioritises other methods of vegetation control, the most obvious one being cutting. Now, incidentally, with cutting using a flail mower, that's a land management technique that we know even less about than Muirburn in terms of its impact on the peatland below. So I think I'd strongly urge caution about prioritising that. But I think in our view that provision around kind of prioritising other methods of vegetation control over Muirburn needs to just be removed from the bill. And the second point to note is that the bill is completely silent on the issue of backburning. Now, backburning, for those that are unaware, is a tool that's employed, it's a type of Muirburn essentially, that's employed during a wildfire incident to ultimately get rid of the fuel load in front of the fire. This bill is completely silent on that, but it was, you know, backburning has been commended in two such parliamentary motions this year, one from Fergus Ewing and one from Kate Forbes, and indeed was used quite extensively, as I understand it, during the Cannock wildfire, which took place over the last few weeks. So just to set that out, that there doesn't appear to be any provision made, Convener, for backburning in this bill whatsoever. Thanks, Convener. Just to say that there is significant concern from land managers, particularly around the notion of kind of ascertaining peat depth, which is clearly something that Nature Scot is going to want to try and monitor. We feel it'd be really important that there could be some sort of provision included that says it would not be an offence to make a false declaration when applying for a licence to make Muirburn on peatland, provided the methodology was followed, because as we've just heard, peat depth can be hugely variable, and how do we know that, you know, the same bit of land, for example, that Nature Scot come and probe when they do their assurance check is the same bit of land that was probed when a land manager did their survey, if that's what's required. There really does need to be some consistency and clarity here, and 100% support the point that Nick Hesford raised about the ignition points being the point at which you actually do that measurement, because that at least provides you with a little bit of clarity. The point at which the fire starts is the point at which you measure, and that would make it much easier for land managers to follow.
Ross, yeah.
Just to make quite an obvious point, you know, it doesn't serve the interest of a grouse moor manager to burn out nests, because clearly you're trying to produce grouse, which are ground nesting birds. So just to make that kind of obvious point, and also to say that I think the far greater risk to ground nesting birds comes from excessive fuel load build-up, and indeed we've seen the dreadful incident at Cannock. Goodness knows the amount of ground nesting birds that probably perished during that wildfire. So just to make that point, that I think, you know, we've got bigger problems than just the Muirburn season to worry about here.